one that treats Israel and its interests and the interests of its agents in the United States and their agents in the United States and dominance of the Middle East to establish their supremacy.
Got the elephant in the room, and that is the Israeli side. We showed a soundbite yesterday of Benjamin Netanyahu, I think on Monday, continue to violate it to make sure that everybody knows that it's not President Trump that's in charge, but it's in Benjamin Netanyahu. And if he didn't want to ceasefire, he won't.
In accomplishing all of the objectives that he was assigned by the Israel lobby and its agents in the United States as Zionist billionaires, if he can't get it done, and he can't bring down Iran, if he can't destroy this state for declaring bankruptcy 6 times in his life, whatever. The bottom line is they're not objecting to this because they've been paid to be silent and go along. But if the Zionist billionaires tell their friends...
Welcome back to the channel. I'm Aaron, and today we're looking at the Iran file. But this is not just a quick update about another spike in tension, and it's not just about the possibility of military conflict. This is about something bigger, how Iran is being presented to the public, where current strategy may be reaching its limits, and what the real cost of this confrontation could be if it continues. So the central question is this: is the United States actually in control of the situation with Iran, or is it trying to preserve the appearance of control? That question matters, because officials' claim of success do not always reflect strategic reality. In modern conflict,
no one has told us the truth from the beginning of this operation until now. We've never had a truthful picture of what we have and have not accomplished. We've had to listen to the little Air Force 4-star stand there like an accountant reading from a spreadsheet and tell us, we have attacked 7,000 targets. We have hit every target, and we have been successful, and we have accomplished all of the assigned tasks.
Strong language can create the image of progress even when deeper limits are already building underneath.
Has lived by it, and one of his rules was never admit anything. Never admit defeat. Say you were successful when you weren't. Say that you're in charge when you're not.
So in this video, we're going to look at this issue through 3 layers: the political logic behind it, and the wider economic and social cost.
Now, when officials talk about Iran, the language is often very familiar. We hear phrases like mission accomplished, successful strikes, target hit, or effective operations. On the surface, those statements sound strong. They create a sense of control, reinforce the image of military capability, and make the public feel that the campaign is moving in the right direction. But that kind of language can also flatten reality. It can make a situation seem cleaner and more manageable than it really is. Because in war, hitting targets is not the same as changing the course of events.
We have hit every target, and we have been successful, and we have accomplished all of the assigned tasks. That's like saying, well, the patient over here who's terminal, we cut off his left leg. We patched him up, near his heart, and we're very successful. Obviously, in the meantime, the patient is dead, but nobody bothers to mention that. You didn't tell us to keep the patient alive. You told us to operate, so we operated. This is stupid.
An operation may succeed exactly as planned. A strike may land where it was intended to land. Officials may be able to present that outcome as proof that pressure is working. But the larger questions still remain. Has Iran actually changed its behavior? Has the broader confrontation moved in a more stable direction? Has the risk of escalation gone down, or has it only been pushed into a new phase? That is where the difference becomes important. A battlefield result can be real without proving that the overall strategy is working.
That's like saying, well, the patient over here who's terminal, we cut off his left leg. We patched him up, near his heart, and we're very successful. Obviously, in the meantime, the patient is dead, but nobody bothers to mention that. You didn't tell us to keep the patient alive. You told us to operate, so we operated. This is stupid.
And a strong political message can create the appearance of progress, even when the underlying conflicts remains unresolved. So, when Washington describes military action as effective. The real issue is not whether a target was hit. The real issue is whether those actions are producing a durable strategic result, or whether the language of success is doing more than the strategy itself. So this brings us to a more difficult question. If military force is not producing a clear political outcome, then what exactly is the strategy still meant to achieve?
This is counterproductive. This is insane. It will come to nothing. But President Trump doesn't want to suffer the humiliation of admitting that we've done all that we can do. Military force is now no longer the right answer, and we're going to take a different approach. And we are going, in the meantime, to disengage our forces from the current conflict. We are going to look to other mediaries, others who are willing to help us to negotiate a more favorable outcome than we can get on our own.
Because a workable outcome is not the same thing as simply keeping pressure in place. It is not just the ability to strike again, deploy more assets, or repeat the same cycle with more intensity. A workable outcome means that force is opening a realistic path forward. It means that pressure is leading somewhere. It means that confrontation is moving towards a result that is politically usable, strategically sustainable, and more stable than what came before. That is where the current approach starts looking much less convincing. If Iran is not decisively backing down, then the core objective remains out of reach. If tensions do not settle in any durable way, then repeated action is not producing lasting control. If the cost continues to rise in military terms, in diplomatic terms, and in broader strategic terms, then the burden of the policy keeps growing, even while the outcome remains unclear. And if the risk of a new crisis is still sitting in the background, then the situation has not truly been stabilized at all. This is the point where capability and viability begin to separate. A country may still have the power to continue. It may still be able to strike, deter, and escalate. But the ability to continue is not the same as having a strategy that makes sense still.
Well, I certainly couldn't argue any of that because I mean, just the contours are all over the place. We just talked about them. I mean, we can't sustain our missile fire. We didn't even talk about that today. But you know, with our interceptor missiles, the PAC-3s, the THAADs, with our offensive missiles, the JASSMs and the Tomahawks, and then just wear and tear on our aircraft. I mean, you just can't do that for an extended period of time. Then the same thing on the ship crews, et cetera. But then we can't break it because the geography of Iran, the way the strait is set up, all those things you just mentioned there, all these are unsustainable.
Because if force is no longer creating a realistic exit, then persistence by itself is not proof of strength. It may simply be proof that the policy has not yet found a way to produce a real result. This is where the discussion has to be more precise. The United States remains the strongest military power in the world, and nothing in this argument depends on pretending otherwise. The question is not whether Washington has the capacity to strike Iran. The question is whether that capacity can be sustained over time inside a prolonged confrontation, without the cost steadily becoming harder to justify.
Sustain our missile fire. We didn't even talk about that today, but you know, with our interceptor missiles, the PAC-3s, the THAADs, with our offensive missiles, the JASSMs and the Tomahawks, and then just wear and tear on our aircraft. I mean, you just can't do that for an extended period of time. Then the same thing on the ship crews, et cetera. But then we can't break it because the geography of Iran, the way the strait is set up, all those things you just mentioned there, all these are unsustainable.
Because military power is never just a matter of raw force. It is also a matter of endurance.
Sustain our missile fire. We didn't even talk about that today, but you know, with our interceptor missiles, the PAC-3s, the THAADs, with our offensive missiles, the JASSMs and the Tomahawks.
Missiles are not an unlimited resource. especially when a conflict begins to stretch beyond short, controlled operations. Aircraft do not simply fly without consequence. They move through maintenance cycles. They require spare parts. They demand technical crews and lose readiness over time as pressure on the system builds. Naval power also comes with limits.
Terror on our aircraft. I mean, you just can't do that for an extended period of time. Then the same thing on the ship crews, et cetera. But then we can't break it because the geography of Iran,
A long deployment does not only affect one operation, it places strain on rotations, on logistics, on the wider force posture that the United States has to manage across multiple theaters at once. And then there's the problem of Iran itself. Iran is not a small, isolated target that can be pressured in one quick, clean direction. Its geography matters. Its depth matters. Its ability to absorb pressure, disperse risk, and stretch that timeline of confrontation matters. A strategy that looks manageable and abstract can become much more costly when it has to be sustained against a large state with a strategic depth and multiple ways to keep a conflict alive. That is why this should not be framed as a question of American weakness. It's not about whether the United States can act. It's about whether a long-running strategy based on repeated pressure can remain durable, even when every round of action adds more wear, more cost, more strain, without clearly resolving the underlying problem. So the real question is no longer whether Washington can hit Iran. The real question is how long that level of pressure can be sustained, what it is ultimately expected to produce, and whether the return is worth the cumulative burden required to keep going. And this is exactly why Washington is unlikely to describe those limits in plain terms. Admitting that a strategy is reaching the ceiling carries a very high political cost.
That's humiliating for him. He can't do it. A great man can do it. He can't do it. This is the product of Roy Cohn. Everybody should look up Roy Cohn, who was his mentor. C-O-H-N, first name Roy. That man was one of the most evil, despicable human beings on the face of the earth. And he imparted his wisdom to President Trump, and President Trump has lived by it. And one of his rules was never admit anything. Never admit defeat. Say you were successful when you weren't. Say that you're in charge when you're not. In other words, never, ever behave truthfully towards anyone. Because if you admit defeat in any way, shape, or form, if you admit that you weren't able to accomplish something, the rest of the world will destroy you. That's his philosophy. His philosophy is straight from Roy Cohn. And that's why we're not going to see any change.
Once a government has presented pressure, deterrence, and military readiness as proof of control, it becomes much harder to publicly say that those tools may not longer be producing the outcome promised. At that point, the issue is no longer only military. It becomes political, symbolic, and deeply tied to credibility. That is why public messaging often preserves the appearance of control longer than control actually exists in practice. Officials tend to keep using the language of strength, precision, and effectiveness because changing that tone creates risk of its own. It invites criticism, it raises doubts, it opens space for opponents to argue that the policy is weakening. The problem becomes even sharper under leaders who build their whole image around toughness. For that kind of leadership, changing tone can look like backing down, and backing down can very quickly be framed as weakness. So often the result is a widening gap between what is being said and what the strategy can still realistically deliver. And the longer that gap is maintained, the harder it becomes to tell the public is losing confidence or that the public is just simply understanding the real control, or that the political need is to keep sounding in control. To understand why this trajectory continues, we have to begin with a more basic question. What interests is it actually protecting? That is the right place to start, because this is not just an argument about tone, ideology, or political emotion. It's a question of strategic priorities. It's a question of how national interest is defined, whose security concerns are being treated as central, and how much independent room Washington still has when shaping policy around Iran. If we look at the Iran file only as a military confrontation, then we miss the layer that may matter the most. Military action tells us how pressure is applied. It does not automatically tell us why that pressure is being sustained, what larger purpose it serves, or whether the political logic behind it is still aligned with American interests in the broadest sense. And that is the deeper issue here, because long-running strategies do not continue on force alone. They continue because a structure of priorities keeps them in place. So if the Iran file appears stuck in a cycle that repeats itself without resolution, the real question is not only what Washington can do militarily, it is what Washington believes it must protect, preserve, or avoid at the political level in order to keep this strategy going. The United States and Israel are close allies, but alliance does not mean identical priorities.
One that treats Israel and its interests and the interests of its agents in the United States as preeminent, as essentially supreme and superior to all other interests of the United States. They do this by insisting that the interests of the Israelis and their agents in the United States and dominance of the Middle East to establish their supremacy, that interest is identical to our own. Well, we all know that's not true.
That distinction matters because the Iran file is often discussed as though the interests of both countries naturally point in the same direction. But in reality, they overlap, but they are not the same. For Israel, Iran is widely treated as a direct and high-level security threat. It is viewed through the lens of regional military balance, deterrence, and the danger of allowing a hostile power to expand its reach. From that perspective, the issue is immediate, existential, and tightly connected to Israel's own strategic environment. The United States has to look at the same issue through a much wider frame. Washington is not only weighing Iran as a regional threat, it also needs to consider domestic economic pressure, the strain of maintaining military commitments across multiple regions, exposure to energy shocks, the level of public support for another prolonged confrontation, and the risks to broader financial stability. That difference does not cancel the alliance, but it does mean that the two governments are not automatically asking the same question when they look at Iran. And that is where the strategic problem begins. When the priorities of an ally are presented as though they are obviously the same as America's own national interests, the space for serious debate starts to narrow.
They do this by insisting that the interests of the Israelis and their agents in the United States and dominance of the Middle East to establish their supremacy, that interest is identical to our own. Well, we all know that's not true.
The policy discussion becomes less about weighing costs, alternatives, and long-term outcomes, and more about accepting a single frame as if no real distinction exists. Once that happens, strategic independence becomes harder to measure and even harder to defend. This is where the discussion becomes more sensitive, and it has to be handled carefully. The debate is increasingly centered on whether Washington is being pulled too far towards Israel's security priorities when shaping its Iran policy, and whether that pull is narrowing America's own strategic room to maneuver.
Got the elephant in the room, and that is the Israeli side. We showed a soundbite yesterday of Benjamin Netanyahu, I think on Monday, declaring openly that he got a report from J.D. Vance while he was involved in these negotiations, and that he said he gets daily briefings from the national security folks in the White House. So, I mean, by all accounts, He's the one who's calling the shots here. And President Trump, and I just cannot for the life of me understand why he allowed, first of all, even before this started, with the agreement that he got for the ceasefire negotiated by the Pakistanis, who said that a ceasefire in Lebanon was absolutely a non-negotiable part of it, which of course the Israelis to today still continue to violate it to make sure that everybody knows that it's not President Trump that's in charge, but it's in Benjamin Netanyahu. And if he didn't want a ceasefire, he won't. Where do we go from here if that maintains its power over our White House?
That concern is not based on one single factor. It emerges from several channels operating at the same time. There are formal alliance commitments, which already create a strong baseline of alignment. There's lobbying, which helps frame policy choices and keeps certain priorities highly visible inside Washington.
Part is that at some point, since President Trump is turning out to be unsuccessful in accomplishing all of the objectives that he was assigned by the Israel lobby and its agents in the United States, the Zionist billionaires, it may turn out that President Trump is more of a liability than an asset. If he can't get it done and he can't bring down Iran, if he can't destroy this state, well, then I guess we'll have to move on to someone else. And I think that could happen because the Congress, remember, is, with very few exceptions, just as much beholden to the Israel lobby and its donors as it is to anything else. So you don't see or listen to or hear very many objections from people on the Hill to what President Trump is doing. Oh, they'll attack him for anything you can think of, for being a member of the Epstein class, for declaring bankruptcy 6 times in his life, whatever. But the bottom line is they're not objecting to this because they've been paid to be silent and go along. But if the Zionist billionaires tell their friends on the Hill that it's time for a change, then I suspect we could see J.D. Vance become president.
There's donor pressure, which can shape the political incentives around how openly different positions are taken. There's also the broader media climate, where some security assumptions become so familiar that they stop being debated as assumptions at all. And then there is the leadership signaling, especially from figures like Benjamin Netanyahu, whose public positioning on Iran has often pushed the issue towards a more urgent and confrontational frame. When these pressures move in the same direction, policy flexibility tends to shrink. That does not mean that the United States loses the ability to make its own decisions. It does not mean Washington is simply taking orders. That would be too simple, and it would miss how influence actually works in a system like this. The more serious point is narrower, but still important. With alliance pressure, domestic political incentives, donor networks, and public messaging all reinforce the same strategic posture, it becomes harder for Washington to step back and reassess from an entirely independent position.
Because the Congress, remember, is, with very few exceptions, just as much beholden to the Israel lobby and its donors as it is to anything else. So you don't see or listen to or hear very many objections from people on the Hill to what President Trump is doing. Oh, they'll attack him for anything you can think of, for being a member of the Epstein class, for declaring bankruptcy 6 times in his life, whatever. But the bottom line is they're not objecting to this because they've been paid to be silent and go along. But if the Zionist billionaires tell their friends on the Hill that it's time for a change, then I suspect we could see J.D. Vance become president. The problem with J.D. Vance, of course, is no change. You're still dealing with someone who is very much in the grip of the lobby and the Zionist billionaires. Now, perhaps if he gets there, he could prove us wrong, but there's not much evidence right now to suggest that he isn't, because remember, you could not join this administration. You could not be on the ticket. You could not be part of the cabinet unless you signed on for Israel first. When you have a system that you've set up, that doesn't mean that you have to pass muster with President Trump per se, but you have someone like Larry Ellison determining whether or not someone should or should not be Secretary of State, Secretary of, Defense, we call it war now, and World War II nostalgia, or any of the other key cabinet posts. you know that you've lost control of your government. This is no longer an American government. It belongs to the people with the money who are Israel firsters.
Over time, that creates a growing question over whether American policy is still being shaped first by a broad definition of U.S. national interest, or whether it's being constrained by a framework in which some priorities have become politically easier to defend than others. And once that happens, the issue is no longer just about alliance. It's about a question of how much strategic independence still exists in practice. Even when the risks are visible, changing course is rarely simple. By the time a strategy like this has been sustained for years, it is usually held in place by more than one force at once. There's pressure from domestic politics, where any sign of retreat can be turned into a charge of weakness. There's pressure from allies, especially when security commitments have already been framed in public and political terms. There's also the symbolic cost of reversal itself. Once a government has spent years defending a hard line, stepping back is no longer just a policy adjustment. It can look like an admission that the original approach did not deliver what it promised. That problem becomes even harder when support networks have grown around the tougher position. Political backing, donor relationships, media habits, and institutional messaging all begin to reward consistency more than reassessment. So when the dangers become clearer, the strategy can remain locked in place. Because once a policy is tied to credibility, alliance expectations, and domestic political identity, changing direction is no longer judged only by whether it is necessary. It is judged by whether the political system is willing to absorb the cost of admitting that the existing path may no longer be sustainable. So after all of that, one question remains at the center of the Iran file. What interest is the United States really protecting first? Because if Washington is carrying the military cost, the political cost, and the economic cost of keeping this confrontation alive, then the final objective has to be examined more closely. What is this strategy ultimately meant to secure? And whose priorities are truly sitting at the center of it?
What are we thinking about? Not Iran and not Israel's national security interests, whatever they may be. Israel is going to have to take care of Israel's interests. We have to take care of ours. And we, like the Europeans, need to get rapidly out of this war, put an end to it, and try to restore normalcy as quickly as possible. If he cannot do that, if he can't bring himself to do that, then he should resign and let someone else come in to do it, because that's what we need right now.
Iran is not only a military file, it is also an energy file. And that changes the scale of what is at stake.
Financial implications of that. Let me just take a look at a couple. You've mentioned both in Asia and in Europe. Here's one from Asia. This is from the Korean Jungan Daily. They're already warning about that they may have to expand vehicle rationing to private sector if fuel prices continue to rise.
Iran sits near one of the most sensitive energy corridors in the world. That means any sustained confrontation around it immediately becomes larger than the battlefield itself. The market does not wait for a full regional war before reacting. It does not need a total shutdown or a worst-case scenario to begin pricing in danger. In many cases, the perception of risk is enough. And that is the point that often gets missed. A conflict does not have to become an all-out war to create a serious shock. If the probability of disruption rises, oil prices can move sharply. Fuel costs can climb quickly. Once that happens, the impact does not stay confined to the Gulf. It reaches outward into Europe, into the United States, and into every single economy that's already struggling with inflation, with transport costs, and political pressure tied to the cost of living. That is why the Iran file cannot, and I mean cannot, be understood only through missiles, strikes, and deterrence. It also has to be understood through energy exposure. Because once energy prices begin to rise, the consequences move through the entire system. Transport becomes more expensive. production becomes more expensive, daily life becomes more expensive.
I think what you're going to see is a precipitous rise in fuel prices here in the United States. And diesel is a huge problem, not just in Ireland, but across Europe, because they have a particular type of diesel that is being mandated by the European Union that depends very heavily on urea. And that particular component is something that comes out of the Persian Gulf in great quantities. If you can't get it, then you have to use regular diesel. But the problem is all the trucks are fitted with catalytic converters designed to use fuel that is based on urea. Now, I encourage everybody that's watching this, go look this up. But if you're an Irishman and you own a truck and your living depends upon the use of that truck to deliver goods for you to be paid, and you can't drive it, that's it. It's the end. You lose everything. You have no income. I don't know if you have a mortgage on your house or not, but you still have to pay somebody somewhere to rent a place.
And when that process begins, the true cost of confrontation is no longer measured only in military terms, but across the full chain of economic pressure that follows. Having domestic supply does not mean being insulated from a global energy shock.
Canary in the coal mine. Now, why do I say or American? There are people in the United States who don't understand that oil is a fungible commodity. That simply because we have a great deal of oil in the United States, that the price of oil will remain low. That's not true.
That is the misunderstanding of this kind of crisis that often is exposed. Energy markets are global in the way they price risk, move expectations, transmit pressure. So even when the United States is less structurally exposed than Europe in some areas, neither side stands outside the shock if tensions around Iran begin pushing oil and fuel prices upward. And once those prices move, the effects do not stay confined to energy alone. They pass into transport, where fuel costs raise the price of moving goods. They pass into production, where higher energy inputs increase pressure on manufacturers and suppliers. They pass into household budgets, where the cost of daily life becomes harder to manage. And once that happens, the issue becomes social as well as economic. Because price pressure is never just about numbers. It becomes a part of a wider strain that governments, businesses, and ordinary families all have to absorb. You can see this first in smaller economies. A country like Ireland is not at the center of the Iran story, and it should not be treated that way.
As you were telling actually Gary and I this morning, there's some issues going on in Ireland too, to where it's already rising to some really big issues with these fuel costs, and there's a lot of protests going on.
Well, I think it's very important to watch what's happening in Ireland. I would say that if you're a European or an American, Ireland is the canary in the coal mine.
But it can work as an early warning example. In smaller economies, fuel stress often becomes visible faster, and supply chain disruption can be felt sooner because the system has less room to absorb sudden pressure without passing it through to businesses and households. That is what makes cases like Ireland. That is what makes cases like Ireland useful in this discussion. They show how external geopolitical risk can begin appearing in everyday economic life long before a full-scale crisis is declared. Rising transport costs, tighter margins, delayed goods, and more immediate sensitivity to energy prices can all surface earlier in economies that are more exposed to imported shocks or have thinner buffers. So the point is, not that Ireland is uniquely important here. The point is that smaller economies often reveal the first signs of strain. They show what happens when energy pressure starts moving through the system before larger states fully register the scale of the problem. In that sense, Ireland matters less as the subject of the story than as a warning signal inside.
Not arriving in the same quantity or the same quality that they once did. In other words, the supply chains you're accustomed to begin to break down. Now, Ireland is a very good place to watch because it's small. Things happen there and their repercussions are felt everywhere far more quickly.
This is where the story moves beyond cost and into social pressure. When a society has been built around a long expectation of abundance, even a gradual sense of scarcity can become politically destabilizing. The issue is not only that prices rise, it is that the experience of strain begins to spread into areas of life that people normally expect to be stable. And once that happens, tensions that already exist inside of society can surface much more quickly. Jobs become more vulnerable when businesses face higher operating costs and weaker margins. Migration becomes a sharper political issue when economic anxiety is already rising and competition over resources feels more immediate.
Something else, and this is something else that we've discussed in the past, I think. They have an enormous number of foreigners in the country that the vast majority of the Irish do not want in the country, do not like in the country, and would like to expel. Now suddenly you have these foreigners who are competing for the same things the Irish population wants and needs, which leads you as an Irishman to say, wait a minute, who are you? Where are you from? What are you doing here? You're from a country 5,000, 6,000, 2,000 miles away, and you act as though you own it, that you have a right to be in my country. That's when things get very ugly. That's when internal unrest races out of control. And at some point, Irish soldiers and Irish policemen who are trying to maintain order are going to have to make a decision. Whom do I protect? On whose side do I stand? Do I stand with the Irish, which is what I am, or am I going to run around and try to protect foreigners?
Welfare systems, they come under greater pressure when more households need support at the same time that governments are dealing with higher structural costs. Even access to basic goods can become a source of frustration when supply chains are disrupted and everyday necessities feel less predictable than before. Now, none of this means immediate breakdown, and it should not be exaggerated, but it does mean that prolonged external pressure can slowly alter the internal mood of a society. That is the larger point. A conflict that begins as a strategic or military issue abroad can eventually reappear as social strain at home.
Listening to this, like you and I, we have all lived in a period of unequaled abundance. We grew up in a world where there was abundance of everything, abundance of food, abundance of heat, abundance of housing. That's changing. We're moving from abundance to scarcity. We've only just started. It's going to get worse. How are we going to deal with that? And I think that's what President Trump ought to be thinking about. Not Iran and not Israel's national security interests, whatever they may be.
It affects how people live, what they can afford, what they fear losing, and how they respond to political stress. And that is the point at which a war outside the West begins to move into the center of Western society itself. And this is where the discussion moves from energy markets into financial psychology. The issue is not only commodity prices, it is confidence. Markets often appear calm much longer than the underlying situation deserves.
At the administration level.
Well, given the complacency in Washington, and you see some of it on Wall Street, people on Wall Street don't understand what's going on. They have no idea. They think that what we've witnessed in the oil markets, the petroleum markets, are anomalies. This is not a new permanent condition. So they don't understand this transition from abundance to scarcity. Eventually, they'll figure it out. And eventually, you'll see the stock market crash as confidence dissipates.
Because pricing does not always react to risk in a straight line. As long as investors believe disruption will remain limited, temporary, or ultimately manageable, the system can continue to look stable even when stress is building underneath. But that stability can be misleading. Markets usually look fine until confidence breaks, and when that break comes, adjustment tends to happen much faster than the earlier calm suggested. That is why the biggest risk is not simply higher oil prices by themselves. The bigger risk is a situation in which strategic stress has already accumulated, but market pricing still reflects too much comfort, too much faith.
Positive headlines here are actually dangerous for us and are going to lead us into the very areas of make it more likely we get into this era of scarcity that you just described as opposed to less likely.
They maintain the illusion. And as long as the optics are good, President Trump is happy, but the optics are not going to get you through this. We're in a real trouble right now. It reminds me again of Thomas Mellon. He was the Secretary of the Treasury in 1929. And in June of 1929, he gave a famous speech and told everyone we live in a period or an era of unbroken prosperity. Everything is fine. And what was he doing at the time? He was liquidating all of his stock holdings, converting everything that he could into gold and cash, and getting out of all the markets. And here was the Secretary of the Treasury who was doing that, telling everyone to relax. Things are just fine. They're not. And I'm telling everybody the same thing right now.
In containment, and too little respect for how quickly sentiments can change. So taken together, the pattern is clear. Militarily, the issue is not whether the United States can strike Iran, but whether those actions are producing a real strategic outcome. Politically, this trajectory is harder to change because credibility, alliances, and domestic pressure all help keep it in place. And economically, the cost may be much larger than the public framing suggests, especially once energy, social strain, and market confidence begin to come under pressure. So the real question is no longer how long can this last, but what it is continuing for. Because if military pressure is not creating a workable political result, and if the costs keep rising anyway, then staying on the same path is not automatically a sign of strength. It may be a sign that the system is finding it harder to admit the limits of its own strategy. A great power loses its way when it can no longer distinguish between real control and the appearance of control. If you're interested in more political discussion, make sure you stick around for the next episode. I'm Aaron, and thanks for watching.